Picture this. It is a summer morning in the year 1054. A cardinal from Rome walks into the most famous church in the entire Christian world, the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The divine liturgy is about to begin. The patriarch is preparing to celebrate. Incense is rising. The choir is warming up. And the cardinal, sent personally by the Pope, marches up the long marble aisle, climbs the steps to the high altar, and slams down a document of formal excommunication. He turns and walks back down the aisle, shakes the dust from his sandals at the door as a gesture, and leaves. The patriarch, when he finds out an hour later, calmly excommunicates the cardinal right back. And just like that, the story goes, the Christian church, which had been one body for 1,000 years, snapped in half. That is the version most people remember. The truth is much messier and much more interesting. The split between Rome and Constantinople, between what we now call Catholic and Orthodox, did not happen on a single dramatic morning in 1054. It was the slow result of 700 years of drifting apart. Two worlds gradually growing into different worlds. Two languages no longer understood by the same people. Two ways of being Christian that were both ancient, both apostolic, both legitimate, and that increasingly could not see each other clearly anymore. Welcome to a new series. Over the next 8 episodes, we are going to walk together through that long story. The Great Schism between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity. How it actually happened. Why it actually happened. Whether it still has to be permanent. And in this first episode, we are going back to the beginning, to the world right after the Council of Nicaea, to ask one simple question. How did one church end up becoming two? To understand the Great Schism, you first have to understand that for the early Christians, the idea of Catholic versus Orthodox would not have made any sense at all. Both words simply meant the true church. Catholic, from the Greek word katholikos, just means universal, the whole church everywhere. Orthodox, from the Greek word orthodoxos, just means right belief. Every Christian for the first 1,000 years thought of themselves as both Catholic and Orthodox at the same time. They were Christians of the one church, gathered around their local bishop, who was in communion with all the other bishops in all the other cities of the world. The earliest organizational map of that church, drawn around the year 400 AD, had 5 great centers. We call them the 5 patriarchates. Rome in the west, the city of Peter and Paul. Constantinople, the new eastern capital founded by Constantine. Alexandria in Egypt, the great intellectual city. Antioch in Syria, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. And Jerusalem, the holy city where it all began. 5 great cities. 5 chief bishops, called patriarchs. All considered roughly equal in honor, with Rome holding a primacy of honor as the first among equals. All part of one church. The arrangement was called the Pentarchy, the rule of 5. For 7 centuries after Nicaea, the Pentarchy was simply how the Christian world worked. The 5 patriarchs sent each other letters. They held councils together. They prayed for each other by name at every Sunday liturgy. When a person became a Christian, they were not joining Rome or Constantinople. They were joining the church, period. But the world the Pentarchy lived in was not staying the same. In the year 395, the Roman Empire was formally divided into 2 halves, an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, by the dying Emperor Theodosius. After that, the 2 halves would never really be ruled together again. The East kept the empire going for another 1,000 years. Constantinople remained a great Christian city, a Roman city in its own self-understanding, with an emperor, with armies, with universities, with high culture, with a continuous tradition of learning. The West, meanwhile, simply fell apart. Within 100 years of the division, Germanic tribes had overrun every western province of the Old Empire. Rome itself, the Eternal City, was sacked in 410 by the Visigoths and again in 455 by the Vandals. The last Roman emperor in the West was deposed by a Germanic warlord in 476. By the year 500, the western half of the Old Empire was a patchwork of new Germanic kingdoms. The Franks in what is now France, the Visigoths in Spain, the Burgundians, the Lombards, the Ostrogoths. Some of them were already Christian. Most of them were Arian Christians, the very heresy that Nicaea had condemned, because Arian missionaries had reached them first before Catholic missionaries had. The Catholic Christians of the West, with their Latin liturgy and their Bishop of Rome, suddenly found themselves a small minority surrounded by Arian Germanic kings and barbarian armies. This is the moment when the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, started becoming something more than just one of 5 equal patriarchs. In the East, the Eastern patriarchs all lived under a Christian Roman emperor in Constantinople who could call councils, settle disputes, protect the church with the imperial army, and pay for the great basilicas. In the West, there was no emperor anymore. There was no army. There was no imperial treasury. The Pope had to do everything himself, by himself. He had to negotiate personally with barbarian kings to spare the city of Rome. He had to send missionaries to convert pagan tribes in Britain and Germany. He had to organize famine relief during plagues. He had to fix the broken Roman aqueducts and feed the poor of Rome when no civic authority would. Out of pure historical necessity, the Pope started filling the political vacuum that the fall of the Western Roman Emperor had left behind. By the year 590, when the great Pope Gregory I, called Gregory the Great, took office, the Bishop of Rome was the practical civil ruler of central Italy in everything but the formal title. He commanded soldiers. He paid for the city's defense. He signed treaties with Lombard kings. In the East, this would have looked very strange. The Patriarch of Constantinople was a churchman, not a politician. In the West, it was just the only way the Pope could keep his people alive. Meanwhile, language was quietly doing its own kind of dividing of the two worlds. In the early Church, almost everyone in the cities of the Roman Empire could read, or at least understand, Greek. Greek was the language of the New Testament, the language of the first creeds, the language of all the early church fathers writing their treatises. Paul wrote his letters in Greek. The Gospels were written in Greek. The first Christian councils met in Greek. But over the centuries, the western half of the Old Empire slowly stopped speaking and reading Greek altogether. Latin, which had once been just the language of Roman administration and Roman literature, became the only language ordinary Western Christians knew. By the year 600, most Western bishops, including the Pope himself, could no longer read Greek. They could not read the original Greek New Testament in the language Paul actually wrote it. They could not read the writings of the great Eastern Church Fathers in their own words. They worked entirely from Latin translations, sometimes good, and sometimes not. The East, meanwhile, mostly never bothered to learn Latin. Eastern bishops in Constantinople could not read the great Latin fathers, like Augustine of Hippo or Ambrose of Milan, except in clumsy Greek translations, if at all. Within a few generations, The two halves of the Christian Church were no longer reading the same books in the same words. They were sharing the same faith, but they were slowly losing the ability to share their actual thinking about that faith with each other. The two halves also began to worship in noticeably different ways. The East kept the older and more ancient style of Christian liturgy, with long sung services that could last 3 hours, clouds of incense filling the church, golden icons of Christ and the saints lining every wall of the building, and the priest facing east with the people behind him, all of them turned together toward the rising sun. The Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is still celebrated in Orthodox churches around the world every Sunday today, took its essential shape in the 5th century. It is a service that has barely changed in over 1,500 years. The West developed something quite different: a shorter Latin Mass with its own distinct prayers and structure, simpler church architecture with the great basilica style instead of domes, less use of icons in worship, and more use of statues and frescoes. A shorter liturgical year with fewer feast days. Different rules for fasting during Lent. Different ways of calculating Easter once the Nicene formula was applied to local calendars. Different chants and musical traditions. Different bread used in the Eucharist itself, leavened bread in the East, and unleavened bread in the West. None of these differences was a heresy in itself. None of them broke the unity of the Church on its own. But all of them together meant that, by the year 700, an Italian Catholic Christian visiting a Greek Orthodox church for the first time would feel as if he had walked into another religion entirely. The same faith underneath, but completely different in feel, in sound, in atmosphere, in everything visible. The political situation only made the drift between the two halves worse over time. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire was hit by one catastrophe after another in rapid succession. The Persian Empire invaded in the early 600s and almost reached Constantinople itself. Then the Arab-Muslim conquests swept out of Arabia after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. Within just 100 years, the new Muslim Caliphate had taken Egypt, Syria, Palestine, all of North Africa, and most of Spain. 3 of the 5 great patriarchates of the original Pentarchy, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Jerusalem itself, fell under Muslim rule and stayed there. They survived as Christian institutions. They kept their bishops. They kept their liturgies. But they were now small, struggling Christian minorities living in Muslim lands under Muslim rulers, paying special taxes, restricted in many ways from public Christian witness. Only 2 of the original 5 patriarchates were still in fully Christian empires by the year 750. Rome in the west, now allied increasingly with the Frankish kingdoms, and Constantinople in the east, surrounded by Arab and Slavic neighbors. The Pentarchy was effectively reduced to a duo, and these 2 surviving patriarchates, Rome and Constantinople, were drifting further and further apart from each other with every passing decade. The final catalyst before our next episode came in the 8th century with a great controversy called the iconoclasm, which means literally the breaking of images. Around the year 726, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III declared by imperial decree that the use of icons, the painted images of Christ and the saints that filled every Eastern church, and that ordinary Orthodox Christians kissed and prayed before in their own homes, was idolatry, a violation of the second commandment. He ordered them all destroyed. For the next 60 years, with one interruption, Byzantine soldiers smashed icons, whitewashed ancient mosaics, and persecuted the monks who tried to protect them. Many of these monks were exiled or killed. The popes in Rome were horrified. The popes of the 8th century, beginning with Gregory II and Gregory III, formally condemned iconoclasm as a heresy and protected the icons that fled west with refugee Greek monks. The Eastern Church itself eventually reversed the policy and restored the icons at the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787. But the damage to East-West relations was done. Rome had openly defied an Eastern emperor on a matter of faith. The Byzantine emperors had openly attacked images of Christ, and the Pope in Rome was beginning to look for new political protection, no longer from Constantinople, but from a new power that was rising in Western Europe, a powerful young Frankish kingdom ruled by an ambitious king named Charlemagne. That is exactly where our story has to go in the next episode of this series. Because what Charlemagne did, with the Pope's full blessing, on Christmas night in the year 800 inside the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, would push Rome and Constantinople into a confrontation that neither could ever fully step back from afterward. So this is the world before the schism. Not two separate churches yet, but one church living in two increasingly different worlds. A Western half that had lost its emperor entirely, that had gained a powerful and politically active pope, that had switched completely to Latin, that was surrounded by barbarian and Germanic kingdoms, and that was surviving by its own resources without imperial backing. An Eastern half that kept its emperor, kept its Greek language, kept its old liturgy, kept its high civilization, but was now besieged on every frontier by Persians and Arabs and losing patriarch after patriarch to Islamic conquest year after year. The Pentarchy was breaking under the pressure. The languages no longer matched. The liturgies no longer looked the same. The political realities no longer overlapped. And underneath all of these visible differences, two genuine theological visions of what the Church really is and how authority in the Church really works were quietly beginning to harden into two different answers to the same questions. The Eastern Church still saw itself as a communion of equal patriarchates, settling disputes together in shared councils. The Western Church was learning to see itself as a hierarchy with a single head, the Bishop of Rome, who could settle disputes with his own apostolic authority. Both visions had ancient roots in the first centuries. Both could quote Scripture, especially the famous words of Christ to Peter in the Gospel of Matthew. Both could claim the Church Fathers. But they were no longer the same vision. The question for the next 7 episodes of this series is how that growing difference between equals and a head would eventually rip the body of the Church in half, and whether, after 1,000 years apart, it can ever still be put back together.